Welcome to part 8 of this Sylenth Masterclass video tutorial, where we'll be looking at and discussing the effects section within the LCD screen here in Sylenth. So you get a host of effects. You get an arpeggiator, a distortion, a phaser, a chorus, an EQ, a delay, reverb, and compression. And all these can be turned on or off by toggling the check mark in the empty box that correlates to that certain effect. Just a side note that when you do have effects on, it will tend to increase the CPU hit that Sylenth is using. And the first effect that you get is the arpeggiator. Sylenth's arpeggiator is really deep. It is capable of doing a lot. It's probably one of the most intricate and or advanced arpeggiators I've seen in most soft synths. There are a couple that have ones that are a little bit more in depth, but as far as like your kind of 4-oscillator virtual analog emulation synths, this kind of takes the cake. So the first thing that you'll see, we're going to go through this kind of left to right here, is if you turn it on, check mark will appear, and I'm going to play a C note real quick, and you can hear what it's doing. So the first thing that you see is this mode box. If you click it, a drop-down window will accompany it. And you have up, down, up, down 2, down, up 2, random ordered step, and chord. So the mode is kind of telling Sylenth what order to play the notes in. So Sylenth isn't just an arpeggiator or a gate. It's also a kind of an automated MIDI sequencer. You can actually make whole progressions off of just holding one note using the step sequencer at the bottom. And that's all dependent on how you set up your mode and velocity within these two drop-down boxes. So let's go through some of these modes real quick. So if I hold a C note and I have it on up, and it's set to octave, you can see it's just going from C2, which you can see right here in Logic. That's the note I'm pushing. And it's just straddling from C2 to C3. So if I play it quick enough and don't give it time for the arpeggiator to kick in, I can do it manually. So that's what it's doing. It's going from C2 to C3. If I play a chord, I'm going to play a C major chord. So it's going, and I just did that manually. So you can hear what it's doing, and that's on up. So if you play a chord, it'll descend upwards. Down's going to be the inverse of it. So right now I'm playing a C2. Because I have the octave set to 2, it's starting an octave above where I'm playing, and it will go down from there. So when you set it on down, it's going to go from C2 to C3, down to C1. If I play a chord, that top note is actually this G note. You can hear that I'm playing that manually. So that is what the down's doing. And then if you select this up, down, it's going to go up and then down. And so I pushed that up to 4 so you could really hear it go. Let me turn it back down to 2. So it's moving upwards and then going back down. And then up, down 2 is doing something in a similar fashion. It's just changing up a few note order of the notes. All right, and down, up is going to be the exact inverse of up, down. And then down, up 2 is going to be similar to up, down 2, but just working in reversed fashion. Then next you get this random one, which will just play notes at random. So again, playing a C major chord. So you can hear that it wasn't doing anything in any particular order. And now you have ordered. So this will play it in the order in which you're pressing the notes. So I'm going to do kind of a weird chord here. I'm going to hit C, G, C, E, but invert everything. So you can see on the keys down there, I wasn't just playing a typical C triad. It was doing something a little bit more interesting with that ordered fashion. And now step and chord. So what step actually stands for is step sequence. And what chord actually stands for is step chord. It's just abbreviated with chord. And what both of these will do is they'll tell Sylenth to look at the step sequencer here at the bottom. So it won't matter how or what you're playing so much as what's set up using these numerical values and boxes in the step sequencer. So the first one, step sequence, plays mono progressions, whereas if you want to hold down chords, you would select chord, which is short for the step chord. So let's go through some of these velocities here under this mode box. So if you select up, for instance, and you set it to 2 octaves, it's just going to go up 2 octaves from where you start. This key means that the velocity is determined by what you're playing or what you're drawing in on the MIDI editor. Now this hold mode is a little different. The hold mode is going to be tied to the step sequencer here. So you have the hold step, step key, and step hold. So again, just to reiterate, if the velocity is set to key, all the velocities are going to be determined by the notes that you're pressing on the keyboard. With hold, all the sequence notes that you're playing or that you have drawn in your MIDI progression will have the same velocity, which is the velocity held by the note you pressed last. So if you're playing like a C major chord and you happen to hit the G harder than you hit the C, it's going to go off of the velocity for that last note, which would be the G. And then step here is going to be determined by the velocities in which you program into the step sequencer. So then you finally have these 2 options, step key and step hold. They're kind of a combo of key and step and step and hold. So basically step and key, there'll be a mix between what you have in the step sequencer and what you're playing with the key, and step and hold will be a mix between the velocities in the step sequencer and then the hold function that we talked about. So let's go over to the right actually with these knobs. And you have 2 knobs, you have a time and a gate knob. Now the time knob is pretty self-explanatory. It will determine the time in which your sequence or arpeggiation is being played. By default, it's at an eighth note time swing. So essentially what Sylenth is doing is it's speeding up the time in between the notes that you hear, but to our ears it just sounds like it's speeding up. And then you have this gate knob, which is kind of cool. So this gate changes the duration between the notes that you hear. So set at halfway at 50% where it is by default, it sounds like what we've been hearing. And if I crank it down, you're not going to hear any sound, just those clicks. So if you turn it up just a little, you'll notice that it's more staccato than it was at 50%. And then if I boost the gate to 10, you're not going to hear any separation in between the arpeggiated notes. So that's helpful for, let's say you have a really, really dense mix and you want to use this arpeggiation sequence you came up with in Sylenth. Well, you turn the gate down a little, because what that's going to do is it's going to make the pass more staccato, which will tend to fit more if you have a really dense pad, rich or ethereal kind of ambient song going on. Now, if you have a really sparse mix without a lot of instruments, it might be better to turn the gate up to a higher amount, like 80 to 100%. So there's less time in between those notes, so it helps fill out the mix. So then going down here, you get this little octave box, and the octave setting will define how many octaves the note sequence will be played, and it goes from 0 to 4. 1 will just play. Obviously, it's kind of like a gate function. So if I do chord here, and I have it set to 1 octave, it's just if I play C, E, and G at C2, E2, and G2, it's just going to stutter basically and gate at C2, E2, and G2. So that's how you can get those gates instead of arpeggiation type feel progressions. Next you have this little warp box, and this is kind of cool. So this directly ties in with the sequencer. So you could, this has a value from 0 to 16. And now you could change this to your blue in the face. And if you don't have it set up to your step sequencer, it's not going to do anything to the sound. So right now it's still not going to do anything. Keyed in some really ugly, basically some sequence notes here. And I'm going to play them for you. So you can hear what it's doing. It's playing that plus 13, plus 12, and then just a bunch of zeros, right? So the best way to show you what this little warp box does is to kind of show you with these ugly notes. So I'm now going to select 2. So what that's telling Sylenth to do in the step sequencer is it's going to play that plus 13, that plus 12 note, and then go back to the plus 13. So now you're not going to hear any of those normal notes. So again, listen. You're not going to hear any of that. So let me go back to 2. So now it's just those ugly notes. So now it's octave, 2 octaves, 1 octave. So the warp is basically a loop function. I don't know why they don't just call it a loop, but that's what it's doing. It's looping a box. So if you wanted to loop out to, like, let's say 6 or 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, there you go. There's 8 boxes on each of these pages. That's a good segue into the next part of it. There's 2 pages in the sequencer, and you can copy and paste in between both of those pages, which makes it easier. The warp function comes in handy if you have a simple, like, 5-step to 6-step, 4-step even progression that you don't want to have to copy all the way out or key in all the way out. Just set the warp knob, or I'm sorry, the little warp box, and it will loop. It'll set a loop point for you. So let's start discussing this actual step sequencer here that you'll see at the bottom of the panel. So the transpose parameters are going to change the pitch of the sound, and they work in semitones, which means it's going up chromatically, which means one step, one key at a time on a keyboard. So for instance, right now, if I play a C note, that's just a C2. Now if I boost this up to 1, that first note is now actually playing a C sharp, and 2 would be playing a D. And you can see I'm still playing C down. And I'm going to turn down the velocity all the way just so you can hear it on these first 2 boxes. See how there's no sound? So watch when I push. There's a delay between when I hit it. It's because I have the velocity all the way down. So you can turn different velocities here as long as you have the velocity on either step, key, or step hold. If you just have it on key or hold, the velocity is not going to work down in the step sequencer. So I'm going to change some of these velocities, and then I'm going to make it go from 1. So let me actually come up with a progression here. Alright, so I just played that on the key. So I'm playing that G sharp. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we're going to boost this up to plus 8. So now if I hold C, it's playing that note. And then I need to boost this, so I'm going to have that hit twice, so it's going to go dut dut. And then I'm going to go to plus 7, because I wanted to play that actual G note. So I'm kind of going, so if I take this off a step real quick, and I'll just play this progression that I'm trying to create. So I need to go now down to C, so I'm going to bring this back to step, and this is going to be 0. So now we have, so this fourth one needs to be 7 as well. And then this is going to be, I'm going to turn this one off. So now you're going to have that little space. And now I'm going to set a loop point, so it's going to go dut 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 dut. I'm going to set a loop point at, let's try 7. I'm going to set the octave to 1, so it just plays the progression once through. So actually I need to set this to 8. Alright, so let's copy that to page 2. And now I'm going to take off my warp point, And in page 2, I'm going to boost these up to positive 12. So they're going to play that C note above it. So now we have a 16-note sequence going on that we just created in real time. It's kind of like a trappish type thing. And I can do, let's do a different time. Let's do 1/8 dotted. So you can see how the velocities come into play, the transposition comes into play, and how I can actually kill whole notes with the velocity. I just turn it down past 0, and so I can turn certain notes up that I want to accent. So let's turn that up to 127. Let's do that note down, up to 127 and turn this one down a little. All right, so now let's do step plus hold. So these hold buttons will now come into play that I just created. You can hear how that's different as opposed to just step. Step is a little bit more robotic. Step hold will be a little bit more fluid. So there is how you can kind of create a really simple type of sequence inside of Sylenth. And when you do record it, it won't actually record the actual MIDI value notes. It'll just, if I hold down C, it'll just be a long drawn out C note. But that basically covers everything in the all the options you have afforded to you in the arpeggiator. One last thing I wanted to touch on was the step velocity modulation source we spent a good amount of time on in the last video. That is always tied to this miscellaneous output here. You can see for source, you can select step velocity right here. So that's always on regardless of whether you have the arpeggiation on or the sequencer on. So let's actually real quick do a chord thing with this. So now if I set to that chord, that step chord, and play a chord, it's going to play my step sequence as a chord. That's a great tool for all you deep house producers out there that want to kind of create some really interesting stacked chord sounds. You can do it in the arpeggiator, and it's really easy to use, as you can see. All right, so let's go on. I'm going to cover 2 more effects in this video, and then I'm going to do the chorus, the EQ, the delay, the reverb, and compression in the next video, so it's going to be a 2-parter for the effects. So next we have this distortion module. And the distortion you have, when you click on it, you have this type box. And if you click on that, you're going to get a drop-down menu, and you'll see overdrive, foldback, clip, decimate, and bit crush. So there are 5 different types of distortion you can use in Sylenth. So I'm going to turn it on right now. And we're going to pull this progression back. And just a quick crash course in distortion. Distortion is created when a signal is basically or effectively you're clipping. In the analog world, it typically sounds better. In the digital world, it's a little harder to achieve good sounding distortion effects. So the amount knob, there's only 2 knobs, so it's really simple, which is good because when you're in a production environment, simple is sometimes really, really good. So you have this amount knob, and it sets the harshness or the grit, I call it, of the distortion. A low amount will kind of produce like a soft distortion, almost like a warming effect. And think of it kind of as a tube amplifier. And then this dry wet is going to basically defines the rate at which the distorted signal are mixed. So a value of 10 or 100% means that you're only hearing distorted signal. Halfway, 50% means half dry signals coming through and half distorted signals coming through. But I'm going to boost these up for the tutorial just so you can kind of hear what each distortion type sounds like. So the next distortion type you get is foldback. Now foldback is a unique type of distortion because normally distortion will basically have a ratio of 1 to 1 from the input to the output stage. Now, foldback is allowing the output signal to continue to fluctuate with the input, so it's not a set ratio. So this will change the tone of the distortion, which you'll hear right now. It's almost pinching off the sound in a way that a high pass or like a low pass 2 filter would. So next you have this clip option, which is going to, clipping distortion is essentially what all distortion is doing, is it's creating clipping. So it's just going to be a really noticeable distortion effect. So there's a dry sound. And you can hear that. And now let's go to decimate. So decimate is going to, to my ears, it sounds like it's a few different types of distortion going on. Because when you have the dry, wet, and a mount all the way up, it sounds like that weird noise. So I hear like it's actually degrading the audio quality a little bit, almost in the way a bit crusher would, but it's adding some very, very harsh distortion to it. So you can kind of create like those Melbourne bouncy trap vocal sounds using that, because you can hear that it's changing the timbre of the sound quite a lot. And then finally you have the classic bit crusher, which is going to lower the bit rate. So that's a good bright distortion type that you can use on leads and basses. So that pretty much covers the distortion module. It's pretty basic. So the next effect is the phaser module. And if you don't know what phaser is basically a filter that's going to create a series of peaks and troughs or dips, peaks and dips in the frequency spectrum. So it's kind of like a modulated signal. So in Sylenth, I believe the phaser is a 6-stage stereo phaser, which means that it's hitting 6 different stages of the phasing process of the peaks and troughs and the frequency notches. So let's discuss what some of these knobs are, because it looks like it's a lot, but it's pretty simple once you get into it. So the center frequency sets the position of the middle notch in the frequency spectrum. So turning this knob makes all the notches go up or down in frequency. So if I play the progression, so it's kind of like widening out the notch, so you're getting a little bit more bass or a little bit more treble coming through depending on which way you turn it. So let's go to the spread knob now. The spread determines the distance between the notches, and there should be a picture appearing, or there should have been a picture appearing that you can see that I'm going to put on the video. So that kind of shows you visually what's going on with phasing, so you get a clearer picture of it if you're a visual learner like myself. So think of it as kind of like a sine wave going up and down, up and down. The spread knob is going to spread out the distance in between your peaks and dips. So it kind of slows down the effect almost. This LR offset is this left-right offset, and you can change the amount of frequency offset between the center frequencies for the left and right channels. This will kind of create like a stereo phasing effect. So now it's mainly, you hear the phasing more on the right side of the spectrum. And then this width knob is a good thing that has width, because it can help if you're using phaser to thicken up sounds. The width is going to basically change the stereo presence of your phasing effects. So it's going to spread it out in the stereo field. Set this knob to 0 to kind of have more of like a mono type sound. So you can hear that kind of helps just spread out the width of the phasing effect. And then next you have the LFO rate and LFO gain. This phasing is kind of like a low frequency oscillator in that it's oscillating at frequencies, but just not as low as your typical low frequency oscillator. And the rate is again shown in values, note values like quarter notes, eighth notes, half notes, etc. And then the gain will turn up that effect. So not all phasers will have that internal LFO. So that's what's cool about Sylenth's phaser, is it has a lot going on. And then you have the feedback. So the output of the phaser is fed back into the input to create those kind of resonance sounding peaks between the notches of the frequency spectrum. So this effect can be controlled using this knob. So let's boost this up so we can hear. So you hear much more of that whole resonance sound that we've heard when we were messing around with the resonance on the filters. And then finally dry wet, that's going to determine how much of the dry signal passes through the phaser without being affected and how much the wet signal is coming through. So that sums up part 8 of this masterclass video tutorial on Sylenth. In part 9, which we're going to be finishing everything up, we're going to go through the last few effects, the chorus, EQ, delay, reverb, and compression. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you there.